Good day, colleagues. My name is Vaughan John. I'm with the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present my research at this Peace and Conflict Resolution Conference. I want to thank the organizers of the conference for this opportunity. My presentation is on trauma recovery, healing, and peace building with the Alternatives to Violence project. I need to start by explaining a little bit about what the Alternatives to Violence project is. The Alternatives to Violence project is essentially a peace education program that offers workshops on nonviolent conflict transformation. It is a program that started in 1975, so it's over 40 years now, and has got significant geographic spread. AVP has been practiced between 40 and 60 countries around the world, including 13 in Africa. It also has a large reach in that there are now tens of thousands of participants who've been through AVP workshops and thousands of trained facilitators that run these workshops. AVP has been found to be versatile in that it has been a program that's helped people in different countries to deal with different forms of conflict and challenges in their context. So, for example, it was used in the recovery and redevelopment and transitional justice process in Rwanda after the genocide. In South Africa and Australia, AVP has been used to train youth with nonviolence. It's been used in some countries to help rehabilitate soldiers, to train election monitors, and a lot of work around trauma healing and working with refugees. But AVP's kind of largest presence is in prisons with prison inmates, and it started off in a prison in New York and has been used in a number of prisons throughout the world to train inmates in nonviolent conflict resolution. AVP is a sustainable form of peace building in that its kind of organizational model involves very low cost working with volunteers through networking and kind of spreading through organic growth rather than having large offices and titles and all the kinds of things that go with big international organizations. So it's quite a unique kind of model of peace building. And I think it's fair to say with this kind of spread and durability, it's a global peace movement at this point. I strongly encourage those of you who are interested to look up AVP, and there are opportunities for workshops in many countries. And I think you will find that it offers a very powerful peace curriculum, both for yourself and for those that you may want to work with. It's essentially community-based, non-formal peace education using experiential workshops. And from these pictures, you can see it's very participatory and learner-centered, using pedagogy like role play and games and so forth, but also customized for local context and drawing on the wisdom and practices and song and kinds of local practices get infused within AVP's curriculum. I've been involved as a facilitator in AVP for over 20 years, but I've also developed a research program over a number of years and been looking at different aspects. So some of my early research has focused on how one becomes a peace educator within the AVP community. I've also done some research around AVP's curriculum and how it is transformed or recontextualized for different contexts and for different kinds of conflict and violence. I've explored AVP's experiential and participatory pedagogy and how that kinds of leads to transformations and change. Some of my more recent research has explored the kinds of powerful transformations that have taken place in the lives of AVP facilitators, and some of these facilitators had experiences of extreme violence in their own lives. I presented this research at the conference, this conference in 2018. My new focus in the research has been exploring trauma recovery and healing, and I'll say a little bit about where this focus comes from, which is the basis for this paper that I'm presenting at this conference. I think the research and literature shows that there's a lot of literature now that shows a strong relationship between trauma and abuse, particularly if this happens early in the life of a person, and how that sets off a trajectory of violence in that life with negative outcomes for the person as an adult. Much of this research has been done through a series of studies called the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies, which show this relationship between experiences of trauma and abuse and violence, and how that then leads to violent trajectories for the individual having these experiences. This kind of experience, and because in South Africa we have this pattern of a lot of violence and young people experiencing this violence, led me to explore how AVP could be playing a role in terms of trauma recovery and healing to disrupt those patterns. So this new area of research is really exploring the psychosocial dimensions of AVP. And I'm particularly interested in AVP's role in post-conflict contexts, countries like Rwanda, Uganda, and South Africa, Burundi, others, but also contexts where there isn't a strong practice of peace education, and where professional psychological services may be limited or withheld for political reasons, or perhaps not culturally appropriate. And in this kind of context, I'm interested in looking at how AVP could be providing a trauma recovery and healing process. And this relates to peace psychology. So in this paper, I'm connecting it to that area or that discipline where peace psychology looks at mitigating direct and structural violence and promoting nonviolent management of conflict or transformation of conflict for a pursuit of social justice. So I've been, and I want to share over the next slides some of the literature which talks about the kind of psychosocial aspects. And I'm going to, in this slide, show some evidence of AVP's promotion of trust and empathy in participants. This quotation from the Rwandan context, post-genocide Rwanda, indicates the kinds of ways in which AVP has helped in that context to rebuild trust. And the authors talk about the belief in Rwanda after the genocide, of where people thought everyone is evil and cannot be trusted, which then hampered forgiveness, but how through running AVP workshops with both community members and with training people who served as Gacaca judges in Rwanda, AVP gently moves into festering wounds and quietly invites participants to see the possible good in themselves and others, and how that facilitated processes of reconciliation, forgiveness, and transformation in Rwanda. This research from AVP in Britain picks up on AVP's impact in terms of building empathy, and talks to the relationship between poor communication and how that serves poor communication and empathy are linked to violent behavior. And then the contrast and counter to that can be through AVP, which helps provide training in communication skills and builds empathy. The research by Nason also measured the change of empathy using the Empathy Assessment Index, and Nason found significant changes in empathy amongst a group of US prison inmates. I've also looked at AVP's effect on anger and stress, because I think that's related to trauma and to violence. Research by Kaiser et al., also with prison inmates in the US, showed that AVP workshops helped to reduce anger with immediate impact, and that when they did follow-ups in a longitudinal study, that change had persisted over time, and this was measured using the state trait anger expression inventory. There's been similar positive results from AVP's impact on prison staff, and I think that's relevant because we know that prison staff have highly stressful jobs, and research has shown them to show alarmingly high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. In post-conflict contexts like Rwanda and Burundi, AVP has been used to support healing and trust building. I mentioned some of the evidence from Rwanda, and this is important because this trust is an important precursor to forgiveness and reconciliation. The Rwandan context used AVP to train the Gacaca judges who were hearing. These are community court systems that ran alongside the more formal court systems, and tried the kind of smaller cases in the genocide, in the genocide, and AVP helped provide these Gacaca judges with a sense of balance and empathy in how they made their judgments. Further examples of this kind of trauma healing work through AVP, the Alternatives to Violence Project, is that in Burundi, there's an organization called TAS, which has been running trauma workshops for community and political leaders. And I think on the website of TAS, you'd see the statement that the seeds of tomorrow's wars grow in the soil of today's unhealed traumas, making very strong links, again, between trauma and violence. But then also the counter of that is that the seeds of peace and hope grow in the soils of today's healing and reconciliation, and they are using AVP or a version of AVP for that kind of process of healing and reconciliation. In other contexts, AVP is being used for trauma recovery with refugee communities. There's several examples of this in Australia and some in Uganda as well. And this is a quotation from a report from one of the organizations working with refugees, showing how participants who'd been through the AVP workshop had reported gaining more control, reduced fear and anxiety, better connections with others, abilities to provide support and care, and those kinds of things which promote both integration but also social cohesion in places of refuge. What the research is also showing is that there are a number of trauma-related workshops that are being developed all over the world using AVP. So these are kinds of customizations of AVP to give specific attention to trauma, and the extent to which it does has led to different terms being used for those workshops. So in some instances, people are referring to trauma-informed workshops or trauma awareness in workshops, or workshops that provide trauma healing or building trauma resilience. Just different terms used for the sense of engagement with trauma in these different AVP workshops. In this slide, I want to present some of the kinds of debates that are emerging within the AVP community related to its role in trauma. And so the question is being asked, is AVP a form of therapy, or is it peace education that has a therapeutic effect, or is it a bridge to therapy? And these statements from three different AVP facilitators, but two of them, John Shuford and Roger Cluck, are also therapists working in the US prison system and with Vietnam veterans. And you can see in their statements that there's some contention. They believe that there's some level of good therapy that's being offered through AVP, but they choose to not refer to AVP as therapy because it is not accepted in the US context, because only trained professionals can lay claim to playing this role of therapy. But I think you could see in these statements that there's strong belief that AVP is playing a therapeutic role or is actually being a bridge to therapy, particularly when Roger Cluck kinds of talks about how AVP works in an indirect or oblique way by building self-esteem and trust, and how that helps with healing and does have a therapeutic effect. In my own research in Africa, I've been looking at facilitators who've also experienced violence, and we know that there are long histories of violence in parts of Africa, and this provides a fertile ground for this notion that hurt people hurt people. So if you've been hurt, you're likely to hurt others. It's a cycle of violence. And what I think my research is showing is that facilitators who have experienced violence can actually transform their lives, and AVP provides a way to rehumanize, and that they can change those trajectories of violence leading to violence as they've done in their own lives. And I think this is a positive, hopeful set of evidence about how AVP can provide a new narrative that counters the one of hurt people hurt people. I also think it's important to consider this role that AVP is playing in contexts where there are limited psychological services. And this statement from Vessel talks about the importance of then having community-based kinds of processes of healing and care that can be serving a wider range of community when psychological services and trained professionals like psychiatrists and clinical psychologists are scarce and overburdened. And I really think that AVP can be playing an important role in these contexts of limited psychological services, as we have seen in post-genocide Rwanda and places like Burundi, and even in South Africa, where I've been doing some of my research. So in conclusion, I think the evidence that I've assembled and been looking at, and some of which are presented in this conference presentation, shows that when one looks at AVP's role, whether it's in prison workshops or with survivors of genocide, we can see that we can see two things. Firstly, that in the actual violence, there's a consistent relationship between trauma and violence. So there's these cycles that violence leads to violence. But also the research with AVP provides us with some evidence and hope of this changed narrative where these cycles of violence can be disrupted for advancing goals of peace education, social cohesion, development, and goals of peace psychology as well. The research that I've presented here will appear in a forthcoming issue of the journal Peace Conflict, the Journal of Peace Psychology. So if you are interested in this, and if you contact me, I can make that article available when it's published. Please feel free to send any questions or comments that you may have, because we can't engage in this virtual conference directly, but I would be very happy to engage with you if you email me any questions or comments that you have. I want to again thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I wish you a good conference.